welcome to the Ovary Jones Show. If you too heard those words, you've got cancer, this is the place to be. I'm your host, Melanie Holscher, survivor, author of Becoming Ovary Jones, and founder of Together Box. Today we're going to be talking to a genetic counselor, and I know you're going to get a whole lot of value out of this conversation. So welcome Amanda Nascimento. Amanda, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We here, most of us anyway, have heard those words, you've got cancer. So most of us are cancer patients here. So we got a crash course, or at least a lot of us did, in genetics, and we're no longer talking about fruit flies and blue eyes. So tell us a little bit about genetic counseling and what you do.
Genetic counseling in general, it can mean a lot of different things depending on the field, but it basically is a way of communicating complicated information, obviously genetics, in a way that is understandable and in a way that can help people make informed medical decisions based on their genetic information. So it can help with medical management, it can help with decision making, and it's just a forum for someone to understand not only genetics, but also decisions that need to be made, pros and cons. So genetic counseling is really communication and communication about complicated genetic information.
Right. So when we're talking about a cancer diagnosis,
Mhm.
when do you typically get involved?
It depends, and probably a lot of my answers will be it depends.
Right.
Yeah, so I do often see patients who have come into the cancer center and have met with the oncologist, and it can be really anywhere along the journey. It can be with a new diagnosis of cancer, can be a little further along, it can be after surgery when maybe they've done some testing on a tumor and it seems like it may be important to have genetics. It might be, not until somebody has thought to ask a patient, what does your family history look like? Those questions don't always come up right in the beginning. I might see someone who doesn't even have cancer, but does have a family history. So really, again, it depends.
Yeah, absolutely. So with my diagnosis, I was diagnosed and immediately hospitalized. And
Yeah.
then I went through radiation. I was in the hospital for almost a month. And then, I went immediately into having a hysterectomy. And then once I got out of all of that, that's when I was, sent to the genetic counselor. So I guess it really does kind of depend. But there are different forms of cancer, obviously. Sporadic cancer is much more common. And then you have hereditary cancer. And I did have a genetic mutation. So, what's the stats around how often, how frequent is there a genetic mutation that is sort of an underlying, not a cause, but maybe a correlation
Mhm.
to a cancer diagnosis?
Yeah, the estimates now are about 5 to 10% of cancers have a link to I guess you'd say a major or a high risk, hereditary cancer gene. We're learning a little bit more now about how maybe there is a part or a contribution from many different genes, but in very small ways, as opposed to, one major, you might have heard of BRCA1 or BRCA2. Many of your listeners probably have heard of those genes. Again, the major contributions, probably 5 to 10% of cancers, but we're learning.
Okay. Yeah, it's evolving.
It's evolving.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. So, yes, I have definitely heard of the BRCA1 and 2. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we all need to understand is cancer is complex.
It is.
cancer doesn't always follow the rules we set for it, and that we're learning, like you said, our understanding is evolving. So BRCA1 and BRCA2, there are two major players in breast and ovarian cancer. There are other genes that have been identified that are maybe not quite as high risk for breast and ovarian cancer as the BRCA genes. But there's also, you have to remember, colon cancer, and there's stomach cancer. There's, all kinds of different types of cancers. And again, cancer is complex. So it's more than likely, a combination of someone's genetic makeup plus environmental inputs. When we think of something like, let's just take BRCA1, since it's pretty common. So that gene, what it stands for, so BR stands for breast and CA stands for cancer, so breast cancer or BRCA, and it makes that gene sound terrible. I mean, who would want that gene, right? Yeah, but it can be a little bit confusing, right? Because we name sometimes genes after diseases, which makes them sound scary and horrible and like not something that you would ever want to have or pass on to your children. BRCA is just a gene. Genes code for proteins, and proteins have a job in the body. So the protein that little innocent BRCA gene makes, its job is to correct DNA errors, basically to stop the growth of tumors. So it's called a tumor suppressor gene, right? It's an important, critically important gene to have. Where genetics can come into play is looking for and testing for genetic mutations, which that term is a little bit outdated. We usually say now variant. A variant in the DNA code in that gene that changes the protein. So that protein that's supposed to stop tumors from growing, if it has some kind of change in the DNA code, it might not work quite as well. Or there might not be enough of that protein being made. And that's what often genetic testing will be looking for.
I gotcha. So when you do identify some genetic variants, what does that mean?
It depends. It's going to be my favorite answer. Yeah, it really does, because it depends, first of all, on the gene. It depends on what that variant might actually do to the protein, because we're not all clones of each other, right? So I might have a piece of DNA at a particular spot in the BRCA gene, and you might have another little bit of DNA, and it might be perfectly fine for each of us, right? No one is a clone. But when the lab has identified a variation in the DNA code that we know makes that either not enough of that protein or makes it not work well, then it's not a diagnosis. It doesn't mean a person is going to get cancer. It means that that's a risk factor for that person. Right. Yes. So if you picture like a jar, an empty jar, and you're filling it with marbles, right? When it gets to the top, that's where you get a cancer diagnosis. So, if you have a BRCA1 mutation, maybe and we're talking breast cancer right now. So maybe that jar gets filled up, 60% or so with marbles. So not all the way, that's not a diagnosis. There's other things that go into cancer. Some we understand and some maybe we're still learning about, but we know there are certain risk factors. If a person has obesity, if a person smokes, but there's also other things that we don't know, how pollution or how our food supply is changing, how the minerals in the soil are changing, vitamin D levels, like things that aren't our fault. It's just environmental inputs, right? And so if you get enough of them in that imaginary jar filled with marbles, that's when you might see a cancer diagnosis. But just being a carrier of a variant in a gene doesn't mean for sure that you're going to get cancer.
Absolutely. So it doesn't have to mean anything, but if we get the genetic testing earlier and we understand that there is a variant, what do we do with that information? I know everybody's probably familiar with Angelina Jolie, and she
Mm-hmm.
took drastic measures to avoid that actually manifesting as a actual cancer diagnosis.
Right.
So
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure it means something different for everybody, but what do we do with that information?
Yeah, the million-dollar question, right?
Right?
So again, it depends on if it's a lower risk gene or so again, we're talking about BRCA, so I guess we'll stick with that. So you would have options. So, you don't have to do anything with that information. It's a personal decision. What might be offered to you as an option would be like Angelina Jolie had chosen. She had her breasts removed, she had her ovaries removed. I don't know if she had her uterus removed, to be honest. So right now, I'm not sure. I would guess she maybe did. I don't remember, but surgery basically to remove the tissues that are most affected by a mutation or a variant in a BRCA gene. With the caveat, or needing to understand that that variant is in every cell of the body basically. So while a BRCA variant most often affects the breast and the ovaries, there are risks to other organs that we can't remove, right? Like the pancreas. You know, that's not an organ you would typically remove
Right.
before any kind of problem with the organ. So anyhow, so surgery is one option. There's risk reducing medication. I believe that your Patty McGee, your last guest, had mentioned that she was on tamoxifen. So that is an option, and the medication and the hormones might depend on how old a woman is, pre or post menopause. So that would be an individual, based on what her oncologist is thinking. And, the other option is, I don't want surgery and I don't want medication. So, but I'm going to make sure, I do my breast self exams religiously, and I get my mammograms once a year, and even maybe an MRI, mammogram and MRI 6 months apart. They're typically staggered. So it could just be a matter of being more vigilant with
Absolutely.
screening.
So, what does that
And
mean for the children? So,
uh,
this is kind of the big can of worms. Once we realize that we have genetic variation, then what have I done to my kids? And do they get
of
tested? And, there's a flood of emotions that
course,
come with that news. So,
yes.
and that's, you're dealing with your own cancer diagnosis. And then to top it off, you're also thinking about your family.
Yes, right. And that's why this is not easy. And that's why also talking to a genetic counselor can be helpful, because, we're trained in empathy and to understand and to really understand the individual and the individual situation, you know. Yeah, you're right. It's a can of worms. And what you do with the information in regarding children might depend on how old they are. If we're talking about a BRCA mutation or a variant, when a child is 10, you know you don't have to do anything with that information. I mean, we typically don't test children for genetic conditions that they're not expected to get until well into adulthood. Different reasons for that. The primary one being they can't really consent. There's not really informed consent for children, particularly when they're young, like 9 or 10, and there's really no medical benefit for them at that young age.
Mm-hmm.
Other cancers, there are a couple of genes where there's an exception to that rule, but most of the time that's not something we do. 50-50 whether a genetic variant would get passed down to a child. So, there's always a chance that your children won't even have to worry about it, in terms of having a genetic risk factor. But it's there. So, typically what's recommended would be, when a child is an adult, so I mean technically 18, they could opt for testing. ideally, they would have genetic counseling first to understand the pros and cons. And there are cons actually to genetic testing for someone who hasn't actually had a diagnosis yet. And I can talk about that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say, children don't need to be tested, particularly for something like BRCA while they're still very young. Even screening, like mammograms and things like that, we wouldn't typically recommend until, 10 years before the earliest diagnosis. So, for example, if a parent is diagnosed at age, I don't know, 45, you know, really we're not super vigilant about screening until 35, say, years old in a child of someone who's
Okay.
been diagnosed.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It absolutely
Yeah.
makes sense.
Okay.
And does it make a difference? Would you test boys and girls?
Good question. Good question. A lot of times people don't think about that when they have sons, for example. Yes, yes. First of all, because while much rarer than in females, males can get breast cancer. So again, if we're talking about BRCA, and so it would be important for them to know for their own health, or at least for them to consider. And also, there are risks with a BRCA gene, for example, again, pancreatic cancer and potentially other types of cancer that aren't just breast and ovarian. And again, they may never get cancer, but then if they're a carrier of the variant, then they could pass that along. So that may just be information they want for their own children,
Mm-hmm.
their own reproduction.
Yeah. So, out of curiosity, if one of my children, for example, wanted to get a test, they haven't been diagnosed yet, of course, what would be the drawback? Are there any drawbacks to them getting tested?
There potentially, yes. You know, one we might think about is just would that change their stress and anxiety and sort of the emotional baggage or ramifications of a genetic test. But even when we think about insurance coverage, there are protections for people who test positive for a genetic variant. You can't be fired from your job or you can't lose your health insurance. There are legal protections that covers most people. There are some exceptions, but most of us can't be fired or dropped from health insurance or charged exorbitant health insurance rates. But there are no protections right now against discrimination in terms of life insurance, long-term care insurance, or disability insurance. So, when I see people in the clinic who have not been diagnosed, I always recommend that they check their coverage. Some people, it doesn't bother, that they don't mind, they don't care. It's just not a big stress for them. Other people say, you know what, we've been talking about getting, life insurance. I'm going to do that first. And it's not necessarily that people are getting discriminated against all the time, but we just don't know because there aren't protections in place. So it's something to consider, particularly for a young person. I would encourage them to at least be thinking about life insurance before they get genetic testing.
Wow, that is so important. I'm so glad you brought that up. And I
Yeah.
know one of my friends, whenever I was diagnosed, she's like, "Well, why didn't you have cancer insurance?" I didn't even know there was a cancer insurance.
Mm-hmm.
You get so busy living your life and building your own business and
Of
raising
course.
kids and doing all that. And, it sort of hit me. I didn't realize personally that my aunt down in Texas had actually had breast cancer. And, the families aren't that close. And
Right.
I didn't even realize it. So, I guess we just don't really think about those things until they're upon us. So that's so important and so wise of you to bring that up. And, thinking about the children of somebody with a genetic variant, absolutely go and, make sure you have your insurance and life insurance and things like that. So important. As
Yeah.
you know, and I very much know, the financial ramifications of a cancer diagnosis are rather
Mm.
devastating.
Yeah.
But um, you know, as long as we live to tell about it, it's okay, right? So, so yes, I think that's incredibly important. So why do we get that information? For me, my doctors were elated whenever they got the news. I had a whole mixed bag of emotions about that, but they were happy because it opened up the doors to some other treatment options. So it
Mm-hmm.
really does lead to how the cancer is managed and what's going to be done about it. Is that correct?
Yeah, it can. I mean, so I just give you an example. I had a patient, this is a while ago now, but she was a young woman, 35 or 6, and had a new diagnosis of breast cancer. And the surgeon wanted to know, am I just taking out a lump, or am I suggesting a full mastectomy and potentially removing the ovaries as well? And so the genetic testing, we did it, we ran it stat so we could get results really soon. And for her, fortunately, she did test negative. And so the surgeon said, okay, so now it's reasonable that we just remove the lump and we leave this young woman with her breasts intact and her ovaries intact. So yeah, it can really have huge ramifications. Or like in the case of maybe someone who tests positive, you know, you you might consider, again, there's pros and cons, of course, to all different types of surgery, but you might consider more extensive surgery to decrease your future cancer risk. It might also inform how often you have screening later, or, oh, I have this BRCA1 mutation and breast cancer, and there's 4 relatives in my family with pancreatic cancer, so I'm going to get hooked up with the pancreatic cancer screening, for example. So it can really inform choices moving forward.
Absolutely. Mine manifested or mine presented as ovarian cancer,
Right.
but it could have very likely been the breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any data? Is it more likely? Obviously, it's more likely to be breast cancer, but ovarian cancer is oftentimes asymptomatic. It's
Yeah.
rarely diagnosed as early because it is asymptomatic. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that the genetic mutation or variant can be very helpful in knowing, what to look for.
Yeah, yes. And you bring up an excellent point about ovarian cancer, which is that, you don't always know until, I've read your book, so I know it was, stage 4, and that's not, unfortunately, that's not that uncommon. There's not great screening for ovarian cancer. So, knowing there's a genetic variant, perhaps you'd have more, ultrasounds of the ovaries, and there are some screening. It's not great. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, ovarian cancer screening is fabulous. It's not. But at least to be vigilant if someone has one of the BRCA mutations. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do a little volunteer work with an organization called OKRA, which is Ovarian Cancer Research Alliance. And
Mm.
some of the survivors actually do some teaching, some training. We share our stories with med
Mm-hmm.
students, nursing students, and I think it's just so important to understand that ovarian cancer can be very asymptomatic and you have to
Yeah.
be vigilant looking for it to diagnose it earlier. I'm not a big fan of stats because I had such a grim
Mm.
diagnosis and it really didn't look good at all. So I developed the mentality that if one survived, so could I. If none survived, I'd be the first. But
Love it.
but it is true that 1 in 3 people will present with cancer sometime in their lifetime, and I think it's 1 in 8 women will have breast cancer, and one in
Interesting.
seven men will have prostate cancer. Is that number coming down? Is that what are we doing? Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, well, those are two different questions.
Right.
But unfortunately, no, I wouldn't say numbers are going down. However, I do think there are things we can do. First of all, people like you and this wonderful podcast and your books and just that message of hope. I took a quote from your book. assume victory. Hope is everything. I mean, it's so powerful, you know. Um, every time I sit down with someone in the cancer clinic, I ask them about stress and sleep and social connection and do you meditate, and if not, do you at least color, some literally color, like anything to just take the stress down, because the lower the stress hormones, the better your immune system is going to work. So I do think there are things we can do, and this is where that epigenetics comes in, right? So we have the genetic code that we got from mom and dad, and we can't change that, right? Um, Epigenetics is basically environment. So it isn't the code of your DNA, but it's how we can um, change how those genes work, how much of that protein is being made. And no, I can't tell you, oh, we can just fix that BRCA1 mutation. I mean, I wish I could say that,
I
but
would
I
be at
can't.
your door tomorrow.
I know, and I would just love it. I would just love to be able to do that. But we can do some things to empower ourselves, right? Like we can quit smoking if we smoke. And everything I'm going to say is easier said than done.
Right.
We can cut down on alcohol consumption. We can move our bodies as best you can with the energy you have. We can, if we have obesity, we can work on that. There are risk factors. We can try to eat the most nourishing foods that we can get our hands on. And I know there's food access issues, in this country, but the best we can do to really nourish, our bodies need the vitamin D. Get out in the sun to the, what makes sense for your skin tone and all of that, because we don't want people getting melanoma.
Right.
But I mean, there's this balance, right? Everything we need the Goldilocks approach to these things, right? Like, so we can tap into positivity, and I know mindset is really important in your work. Again, stress management, like there's just different ways that we can make our genes work for us the best that we can help them work for us. Having a genetic variant is not your fate or your destiny to then be ill. Yeah, I just
I
feel really
love that
passionately
line. Can
about.
you repeat that line? It's not your destiny.
It is not your destiny. Genetic mutations or variations in your DNA are not your destiny. They
Absolutely.
are what we work with. We all start with what we can't help, right? But we can make them work for us the best that we're able to.
Yes.
I think joy plays a part in this play. How many of us play anymore? We play when we're kids. We don't play when we're adults. And maybe playing is just, I don't know, getting on a trampoline for 5 minutes or coloring. I come back to that because I personally do color. I have colored pencils and some adult coloring books. But that mindset, community, giving back like you're doing, the Together We Box is amazing. Just really giving back. Yeah. We're not to blame for
Yes.
our diagnoses, and we can do only what we can do. But I think it's important to approach any kind of chronic illness really with the attitude of you're not a victim. You are in a tough circumstance, and you do what you can each and every day with the energy and the resources that you have to just live that day. Live that day. What? Well, before I keep going, I could go on forever about this. I will give you a chance to talk on your own show.
No, 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 absolutely. I provide this platform to hear from people like you that are so helpful in a patient. You may only walk beside somebody for a brief period of time, but hearing a little bit of hope from your voice and hearing that while you can't change the diagnosis, there are things that you can do to put yourself in a better mental place to be able to do the things that you need to do while the doctors are working on your body. So
Right.
I just think that from the healthcare side of things, we need a lot of support emotionally through a diagnosis like this, and to hear that you're trained with empathy, and obviously you've demonstrated that abundantly today, but I think that it's just so important for what you do to be able to give somebody this is a look at the genetic side of things, but this is, just a piece of it. This is not your destiny. So I just thank you so much for bringing that message.
Absolutely. It's so important, and in the cancer center where I work, there are social workers for sure. I mean, I have a lot of empathy. I also have extra training. So I have become a health and wellness coach, really inspired by the patients that I have in the cancer center, because I'm just realizing how important it is. Some of these lifestyle things I just mentioned, like it's easy for me to say, eat better or stop smoking or exercise. But there's this gap between, we all know Twinkies and Doritos are not our friends, right? And then there's giving up the Twinkies and Doritos. And like a health coach can sort of bridge that gap, and really help people with habit change. And
Absolutely.
I just felt like it was so important for me to be able to just learn how to help people help themselves and become their own advocates for just beyond their diagnosis. Like, again, living that each and every day, doing what we can. So
Absolutely. I think that is beautiful. And it, you know, intellectually knowing what we should and shouldn't be doing, that's one thing. Putting
yes.
that into practice consistently, I do believe that's where a coach really makes a big, huge impact, because a lot of times, we'll know what we should be doing. We try it for a day or two. It, we might even have some early success, but creating those habits, changing habits that we've had for many, many years, our whole entire life, and then trying to, live differently, that's a challenge. But having
Yeah.
somebody coming alongside and coaching you through it, and I always say we hang out at the intersection of grit and grace, because sometimes we have
Love
to
it.
grit through something. But whatever happened yesterday or last week or last year, we've got to give ourselves grace. And I think we're just so good at beating ourselves up that if we could just give ourselves some grace and let that go and just work on staying present in the moment with the meditation and the coloring, and dreaming, assuming that tomorrow's going to be better, and having that hope and just working for better tomorrows, and just constantly becoming. And then I think is when we can start to find the joy and the peace in a storm like cancer.
Yes. My new favorite word, I learned it not that long ago, but it's equanimity. And it means essentially, being the calm amongst the chaos, and I
Right.
think like that I take with me. I even put it in my phone, like in my notes, like just equanimity. I mean, I think it's a lesson for all of us, particularly when you're facing a diagnosis. But it's just so critical to have the calm as best you can, and with with the support you need, and all of that, but to maintain, you are not your diagnosis.
Right.
You are not cancer, you are not cancerous, you are an individual human who is dealing with something terrible. And hopefully there's another side, after that, after the fear, after the sickness, after the chemo and the infusions and just all the stuff. Hopefully, you are a wiser, stronger human who can then give back to people who are struggling.
Absolutely. And I think those storms, whatever the storm is, whether it be cancer, whether it be any storm, we are all going through storms, right? So I think we just need to learn how to be strengthened and learn from those storms, and let them make us into a better version of ourselves. There's a guy named Ron Alford. He is with Southwestern Coaching, and his son Van was diagnosed as, with leukemia, I believe. And Ron told me one time, we're always in three buckets, basically. We're either going into a storm, we're fighting a storm, or we're coming out of a storm.
Mm-hmm.
But no matter what, there's going to be storms. Whatever the storm is, in my case and in many of the listeners, it's cancer. But we're still, even after that, going to be going through other storms. And I think just adopting that mentality of allowing the storm to make us better and learning to dance in the rain and find joy even in the storm. And I know it's challenging. I really do. But there can be great peace even in the storm. And as we're coming out, the storm can make us a better version of ourselves. As I talk to so many guests on the show that are actually thankful for their cancer or thankful for the lessons that they've learned through their cancer. So I just think it's an incredible thing.
Powerful. Really powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if somebody were interested in getting in touch with you for health coaching, where is your hospital and how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so my hospital has a very long name. It's called UMass Memorial Health at Harrington. So it's UMass, meaning University of Massachusetts. So it's in Massachusetts. It is part of a large health system, but it's really a gem of a community hospital. So it has the resources of the big health center, but it itself is a small little community. I've been there almost 2 years, and every day I go in and I'm like, gosh, these nurses and the care providers, they're just so amazing and dedicated. So shout out to Harrington Cancer Center. Really, it's been amazing. So if someone wanted to get in touch with me, we do telehealth, but again, I'm licensed in Massachusetts. So if you're in Massachusetts or you live close by, South Central Massachusetts, you can call the Cancer Center to set up a genetics appointment. And that's the best way is just to call. And that's 508-764-2400. If someone is interested in health and wellness coaching, I do that all virtually. So that's telehealth. It doesn't matter what state you're in or even what country you're in. And you can reach me at amanda@coachamandan.com, because Nascimento is a mouthful. So I given everybody a break on that, having a URL or an email address, 28 characters long. And that's my email. I will have a website. It is coming. I do practice what I preach, so I make sure I sleep and I meditate or color and exercise. So I am not as, my website is coming. It's just not here yet. And that will be coachamandan.com.
Coach Amanda, thank you so much for talking to us today. I think this was such just a beautiful conversation. Yeah. I'm really enjoying hearing about your work and what you're doing for so many people. It makes a huge difference. So I can't tell you how valuable your work is to people like me, patients just going through all of this. So thank you so very much. I will link all of that in the description below. Great. So your phone number, your email address, all of that will be linked so people can get in touch with you. And I hope in the very near future you will come back on and we can share some more and have another conversation, because I just think the more we can have these conversations, the better. So thank you so much for taking your time today.
You're very welcome.
I just think the world of you.
Thank you. Likewise.
So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Coach Amanda. She is incredible. If you will, please like, share, and subscribe. That just really helps us get the message out. We just want to help as many cancer patients as we possibly can. So if you would do that, I would certainly appreciate it. The next show you're absolutely going to love. I can't wait to bring that to you. So stay tuned. Talk soon. And in this moment, you are okay.